I think this opportunity that we're faced with in the journey of aloha is to understand that those lessons will help structure our journey so that we are successful.
Our entire One World Ohana connected heart to heart through pure aloha.
Aloha mai. Aloha aku. Aloha mai. Aloha aku. Aloha mai.
Hearing more about what everyone has to offer and learning from each other.
Aloha aku, aloha mai, the two faces of aloha. To give and to receive. It goes out and it comes back.
If you are interested in learning more about aloha, learning more about how you can connect with other people, I think this would be a good opportunity because different people of different ages come with thoughts that promote what you are doing. So I think you should join us because it'll be an experience that you'll never forget.
Aloha is about leaving people full. It's about leaving a place better than when we found it.
Knowing how to be in community, how to feed people, how to come together.
We're going through the greatest transformation since Copernicus discovered that the sun does not revolve around the earth. We know from physics that we are all connected energetically. That's who we are. We're connected just like all our atoms and molecules and all the energy are connected.
Thank you.
The whole elephant revealed refers to the Sufi story of the blind men around the elephant, where each of them has a different perception of the whole. And that's what we're trying to get. Western science was a step in the direction, but it can't be the whole elephant. It can't possibly be the whole elephant. So we're trying to see, what does a universe look like to other peoples? We're a multicultural planet. We're globalizing. We're not homogenizing. You know, monoculture is something that people thought up. It doesn't exist in nature. And it doesn't work very well. We see that from what Monsanto's doing to us. You know, that monoculture just is it's unnatural. And we'll get over it, you know, we'll get over it. So we're weaving stories together. We right here in this room are weaving the future for ourselves and many other people. And everything we do affects the whole because we're so interconnected. So our own evolution here in the room is an important part of evolution. And I want to talk a little bit about my way of looking at evolution. But do you want to talk about the European thing first?
I want to get into the European Indigenous mind a bit. I was in West Africa with one of my beloved mentors, the late Hale Makua from Big Island. And Mr. Makua and I were at a gathering of voodoo and healers, almost 10,000 of them, just boiling hot that day. And as the groups of practitioners, the voodoo and healers and the tradition almost died out because of slavery and colonialism. And a friend of Mr. Makua's and myself, Dr. Eric Badozo, who's an MD and a traditional healer, took it upon himself to help bring the traditional healing back because there's not enough Western medicine in West Africa, and besides which most people prefer their traditional healing if they can get it. So his work was so successful, his model of bringing these two systems of healthcare together was so good that within about 20 years' time, it had gone from about 400 really authentic healers to thousands that were on the beach that day. And they came by in drum groups as Mr. Makua and I were sitting under an awning, kind of like a grandstand, and they were coming by the grandstand in groups, and there was one group that came by that was just strikingly different from anything that any of the rest of them. And when I asked Mr. Makua, I said, "Who are those people?" And he looked, he said, "Deneb guys." And if you know Deneb, that's a star in the constellation of Cygnus, the swan. And he said, yes. He said, the swan, he said, he said, the European people, just out of the blue, he said this to me. He said, the European people carry the power of all movement in the universe. They carry the power of fire, of a sacred fire. He said, but they've forgotten it. And the only thing that's left of this knowledge is the Mother Goose stories. And that's, he said, but it refers to that sacred swan. And then he told me a story about something that had happened to him at Hononau and at the temple there, and how he had gone into it and envisioned seen these sacred eggs, and he talked about them at some length. So the way he talked about it made me think, well, it's possible for European people then maybe to recover this indigenous mind. It was an inspiration that came to me on the beach that day. Later, we went to visit Guri Island. We went out on this beat-up old boat, and we got to this island. I didn't know what we were going to see, and it turned out that it was a place where indigenous people of West Africa were rounded up and held there, and they were going to be shipped out as slaves to America and to the colonies, right? And oh my God, it was just like there's a tree there that the slaves, the people who are going to become slaves, they insisted with their loss of lives that this tree be planted, and there was a ceremony to walk around the trees so that they could leave their soul there when they came to the Americas, and that they could come back sometime. So I get into this building, and it looked like an old fortress, and I was becoming really sick, and in fact I had come through a bout of cancer and had side effects of radiation, so I was really ill myself. And I got into this building, and I started feeling worse and worse and worse. And then we went into one room where the women were put for breeding, and the children were put here, and then there's a pit where men were thrown into, you know, like solitary if they tried to resist. And then there's a window. It was called the door of no return. It was such a horrific thing that happened that some people would jump from that window into shark-infested waters rather than get on the boat. And it was then I learned that the upstairs was run by the upstairs, to all this human misery, was where the bureaucrats and the administrators lived, and they were French. And I told you I'm almost half French. When I heard that, I wanted to vomit. I was so sick, right? I couldn't get out. I couldn't find my way out of there fast enough. And as I was leaving to go, one of the main medicine people, a very old man, he looked at me and he said through the interpreter, "Hello, my sister." Oh my God, buckets of tears. So I ran out to the ocean, and I stood in the ocean, and I was just breathing and trying to come back into myself. Then it was at that point, I looked at my work and I said, I'm continuing this academic work of Indigenous Mind because I want to remember and atone for what my French people, ancestors have done in this world. And as an Indigenous woman, I know a way back. I know a way back. And that moho has given me that way back. And in front of this massive number of voodoo and healers going by, Dr. Bedozo said to the people there, he acknowledged me and Mr. Makua, and then he said, Apila is running the world's only program where our traditional knowledge is taught. So what I found out from that time is that I was going to get my French Indigenous mind back. And by God, I have. The way just opened up for me. And the way took me every single year at this university I work for, Wisdom University, does a workshop in France. And every year I've been asked to go there to do traditional spiritual things and open the session because it was a pagan site before it was a Catholic site. When I was there, I met other people, and now every year I go to the caves of France, the painted caves of the south of France. I've met a traditional community that still speaks its language, its original language, one of the oldest tribal languages in Europe, and it's a hidden community. And every year I go there, and every year something more wonderful and powerful opens up with my French Indigenous mind, and I see how the two can come together. So I wanted to mention that because what I learned from Mr. Makua and from the other elders who work with me is that that Indigenous way of knowing and being, it's not lost. We're lost, and we can get it back. Thank you.
I went to Greece and decided to write novels to explain the human condition to myself. And that was good for becoming a storyteller, for getting rid of my scientific jargon. But then I decided I still wanted to be a scientist, so I decided to put together the story of evolution. And in a nutshell, what I discovered was that the story I was taught, the Darwinian story, is just the first half of an evolutionary cycle. It's the juvenile phase of a maturation curve that goes on beyond Darwinism. And the way it works is you start with a unity that differentiates, individuates, like the early Earth's crust is a homogenized set of minerals, and out of it bacteria package themselves, right? Now those bacteria were the only creatures of Earth for 2 billion years, which is half of evolution. Think of evolution, very simple numbers, 4 billion years. 2 billion are half of it. During that time, the bacteria covered the Earth. They went as deep as you can go, as high as you can fly, in the waters, on the land, everywhere, coating it, changing the continental shores, changing the atmosphere, changing everything about this planet massively, as invisibly small as they were. If you could have watched the Earth for those 2 billion years from a distance in a short time, you would have seen a lot of movement, besides which the land masses were moving around too. On the, they were floating like canoes on lava, right, on the magma inside the Earth. So there's a lot going on in those first 2 billion years that most of us didn't learn anything about in science classes that were about evolution. And what it was mostly about was the creative, inventive, competitive, juvenile phase of life, where it expands, it multiplies as fast as possible, it takes all the resources it can to do that, it diversifies, it invents things. Ancient bacteria invented everything from the electric motor. You can Google bacterial motor and you'll see that those motors, which for instance male sperm have, they have over 40 proteins in them. They have rotors, stators, camshafts, everything, that our motors do. And they're 99% efficient. So you've probably heard the word biomimicry these days, meaning copying nature to see what were its solutions to technological and other problems. So anyway, what happens after feisty bacterial imperialism, they invade each other, they, just go through everything. It's all in my Earth Dance book if you want the details, and there's a free copy of that on my website, which is just mylastname.com, and there's now an ebook Kindle thing for it. But anyway, so what they do is they come to a point where the colonialism isn't working anymore. The colonies are dying from the exploitation and stuff, and they finally get it. And this is the one thing I want you to remember about when do species move out of the juvenile competition into a mature cooperation, is when they discover that it's cheaper to feed your enemies than to kill them. Takes less energy biologically, less money in our culture. Unfortunately, in the juvenile mode, you're really into profits and hoarding and acquisitiveness, and so war has become not about differences. That's just what they pretend so that you'll support it. It's about that it's profitable to destroy countries, and then it's profitable to rebuild countries, insofar as they actually do, but they drag that process out a long time. So That's what happens. When you have individuation, you get tension and conflict because there are different self-interests and, there's competition. And eventually, though, if they don't kill each other off, they start negotiating some of their differences. And as they negotiate some of those differences, they start working out cooperative schemes. And you see this in modern humanity, in organizations like even after the Second World War, when all the oil companies got together and made cartels, they cooperated in dividing up the oil fields of the world and who was going to do which technologies and stuff, so they could exploit the rest of the world. So it was still juvenile game, but starting to get into cooperative mode. The United States is an effort at a cooperative union. So is the European Union. We're trying these things out. NATO is that kind of an alliance. So we see this kind of thing happening where they're starting to come together cooperatively. But now we've reached the planetary limits on so many things that it has to go to the global level. We have to move into global family if we want to survive. We can't exploit anybody. And the spiritual aspect of that is knowing our oneness by understanding Eastern science that comes out of the Vedic literature and thousands of years of research on consciousness. We have all this information. We have people like the Dalai Lama now coming into Western neurological labs and having his monks tested. And, Western science didn't study the mind because they didn't have any disciplined minds to study. So every time they tried to study anything about the mind, it was such a mess. They couldn't get any good information, so they said, that's internal, that it's no good. Let's stick to the outside. And as one famous physicist pointed out, even in the 40s, we make up our models of the universe in our minds and then leave our minds out of the models. Well, that's just because they were too hard, so they swept that under the rug. That nobody has any experiences outside of consciousness, but we don't talk about it. So anyway, the maturation curve was pioneered by these ancient bacteria who eventually built these enormous cooperatives, which became the nucleated cell. And the nucleated cell never had to be reinvented. It worked so well. We're made of them, right? That was the big cooperative. All the bacteria that joined in, the different lifestyle bacteria that joined into those cooperatives, gave some of their DNA into this central library we call the nucleus. They gave some of their DNA there. Now, DNA is like books in a library. It can't do anything by itself, just sits there. It's a crystalline substance. It is protein that activates the DNA, that moves it around, that changes it, and that brings it, uses the blueprints in the books to make things. Okay, now this cell, this big cooperative cell, is the fruit of cooperation in evolution, but it's a new entity now. And a new entity has to go through its own youth. So for the 3rd billion years of the 4, those big nucleated cells duke it out, get creative, invent different lifestyles, and ultimately discover that it's cheaper to feed your enemies than to kill them. And what's their cooperative? Multi-celled creatures, right? We're multi-celled creatures made of bacterial cooperatives. Lewis Thomas, who wrote all those lovely little essay books starting with Lives of a Cell, quipped, maybe we're big taxis the ancient bacteria invented to get around in safely. Well, you have about 100 trillion cells in your body. 100 trillion cells, and each of them is as complex as a large human city. Each of your cells has about 30,000 recycling centers to keep your proteins healthy, run by proteins. Proteins are what you see when you look in the mirror. You don't see the fat and the minerals and the, you see the protein. So 24/7, every one of your 100 trillion cells has 30,000 recycling centers that are about as high-tech as sticking a dead tree into a chipper machine and getting a live tree out of the other end instead of chips. That is why biomimicry is a good idea, because the ideas are all there, they've been invented, and we get to look at them and see how we can do things that sustainably at ambient temperatures, no heating, beating, treating, no wasting 96% of the resource and then throwing the other 4% you make into a computer or whatever into a landfill a few years later. The role model is all there for politics, for economics, for everything. Every one of your cells has about 1,000 bankers. Those are mitochondria, once free living bacteria. They give out free stored value debit cards 24/7 with ATP currency loaded onto them. And when you've spent it into the economy, you take it back to the bank, they give you a new line, you never pay it back, and certainly no interest. We do not have to do debt money. We'll talk about those economics tomorrow. Today we're on science. The science is none of your organs are exploiting each other. Your cells are fully employed. The decisions are made cooperatively. It all works pretty well. And you were an expansive economy up to puberty and then had to level off and become as sustainable as possible for as long as possible. And that's exactly where we are now. Now, the indigenous people, in many cases, went through to the maturation of building a cooperative at a larger size level by getting tribes together to build larger centers, urban centers. And most of those early ones have no weapons and don't have any walls and were either for religious ceremonial purposes or for trade purposes. And they learned the cooperation and built these bigger units. And that went on for almost 100,000 years of being around on the planet as two-leggeds. And then for the last 4,000 to 6,000 years, those new entities had to go through their own youth, and we're still in it. That is the age of empire. They were first governed by actual emperors and then by national empires. Now we're at corporate empires. Same process. It is the youthful mode. Capitalism is a strictly Darwinian youthful mode. That's why the early capitalists loved Darwin, because it fit and it rationalized exploitation. But now, by the way, the Soviet Union was teaching Kropotkin's book, Mutual Aid, which was all about cooperation in nature. And now you know why when you look at nature, you see both cooperation and competition, depending on whether a species is in the youth phase or in the mature phase. And oddly, ecologists don't see the progression from one to the other, even though they identify type 1 ecosystems as having very highly competitive, expansive species in it, and type 3s very interwoven, feeding each other, cooperative ones called climax ecosystems, as opposed to pioneer. And they don't see a learning curve because they don't think nature's intelligent and therefore it can't learn. But that's like having an alien come down to the planet with his little notebook and watch babies crawling and children running and grown-ups walking and older people white-haired and stooped over and writing down 4 species because they don't stay long enough to see that there's a curve here, a growth curve here, a maturation curve. So I want to leave you with that concept that globalization is the end of empire building. And most of these guys that are running those corporations don't know what to do. They don't know about the rest of evolution. They've only been taught the Darwinian theory. And that's why I feel a great responsibility as a scientist to say, no, there are other sciences on the planet that have figured this out a long time ago. And we need to give them equal status with Western science so we can talk to each other and move into the appropriate cooperative global community that's being built by over 1 million NGOs, all these grassroots movements. All of you are learning to live the future now, as we said the other night, by treating each other the way you want people treated in the future, by eating the foods you want people to eat in the future. The only way you get it now is you don't sit and wait for it to happen. You steer your canoe in the right direction, and you talk to the other canoes full, and we do the future. We just start to live it. That's how it happens. Always now. It's always now, and we're doing it now.
Well, I'm doing this. Let me invoke this is an image of an ancient Kiha Wahine who's now actually in the Berlin Museum, and I visited this museum and saw her. And she's coming out, you can't see it, but the image here, she's coming out of the water, and this is the lizard spirit or the lizard goddess of Maui. And my husband actually, with the help of the museum and photographs, has recreated her too, along with Hina. So the thing is, when I became inspired and under the aegis of the Kiha Wahine, I said I developed academic programs to help people remember Indigenous mind. And in addition to what you were saying, Elizabeth, about the choices that we make and what we eat and how we sail, what we do to help people remember their Indigenous mind is focus on areas of, first of all, studying the genealogy that we come from, and this automatically brings in the woman because we come from a mother, right? So we study our genealogies, we look at dreams and we share dreams. We research the symbols of one of our indigenous lineages, and we study languages when it's available. We also do an ancestral journey. Everyone visits the motherland, fatherland of one of their lineages. And we do it in the company of each other. And the pivotal course or the instrumental nexus of the process that came through the Kiha Wahine and expressed through these programs is the course on the cultural shadow, on dancing with the missionary, colonization, missionization, and how each of us historically lost our Indigenous mind. Like, how did we lose it? We had it and then it was gone. So we look at that and we do that in the company of others, so that what I've seen is that any circle of students, there's going to be someone in that circle whose culture oppressed your culture, and there's going to be someone in that circle whose culture you oppressed, right? So the underlying idea is that courageously people who are drawn to do this deep ancestral remembrance work, to recall their Indigenous mind, to integrate it in today's time, this ability to know and perceive, and then also hopefully have the tools of some sort of science or training, can bring these together to help create this new consciousness, to be in this new consciousness. And the amazing thing is how quickly it happens. It's almost as soon as people show up to do this work, this academic, they're already underway. And my job has been just building that fire and holding that space to support people in doing this deep work.